In the 8th year of Augustus Caesar's rule, in the heart of the Roman Republic's transformation into empire, a young woman named Aelia stood before the family tribunal. What she had done was so offensive to Roman virtue that her name would later be removed from every household record. She had refused marriage, not to a stranger, not to a foreigner, but to a Roman senator, handpicked by her father, and for that defiance, the punishment would not be a clean execution. It would be a slow, erasing kind of death that left the body alive and the soul forgotten. She was 17. The marriage had been arranged since she was 13. The groom was 29 years older, a senator loyal to Augustus's reforms and in need of a third wife. The date had been chosen for political favor. The veil was already embroidered, but when the day came to accept the pact, Aelia did not bow her head. She stood still and said only once, "No." In Roman law, a daughter was res, a thing not to be consulted, only handed over. Her refusal stunned the household. Her father, a veteran of Caesar's old legions, stared at her as though she had spoken in a foreign tongue. Her mother turned her back, but no one raised their voice. They didn't need to. Roman punishment did not require rage, only silence, formality, and precedent. That evening, Aelia was confined to her sleeping room. The doorway was sealed with a black thread, a symbol that she had broken the social contract. By morning, the family physician had written her name on a wax tablet beside the word deviata, the deviating one, and once that was written, the process had already begun. She would not be beaten, that would cause bruises. She would not be starved, that would be visible. She would be reformed from the inside out, using rituals sanctioned by priests, midwives, and the law. Her bedding was replaced with straw, her jewelry taken away. Her meals reduced to offerings, dates, salt, watered wine. The household slaves, once her caretakers, were ordered not to speak to her unless instructed. When she wept, no one came. When she screamed, the doors did not open. The silence became the punishment. Every day she remained unmarried. The shame deepened. Every day she resisted, the more she proved herself mad. Because in Rome, a woman who refused marriage could not be sane. And a woman declared insane could be hidden, locked away, or legally sacrificed to preserve the honor of the paterfamilias. By the 3rd day, the temple rites began. Not for her soul, but for the family's reputation. Offerings were made, wine was spilled, her red veil was placed on the household altar, untouched. Aelia watched from the shadows of her barred window as her own dowry was burned. It was not punishment, it was purification, and it had only just begun. The priestess came on the 4th morning, veiled in white, her voice low and without expression. She did not look at Aelia when she entered the room. She only laid down a folded garment, a tunica recta, the robe worn by Roman brides on their wedding day. Then she spoke the sentence that ended all argument. The gods require your obedience. No law was needed beyond that. Rome had no courtroom for girls who disobeyed quietly. Instead, it had rituals, legal fictions, sacred customs that blurred the line between punishment and piety. Aelia was bathed in cold water mixed with crushed herbs meant to banish impure spirits. Her hair was combed in the traditional style of the Senicrines, 6 braids tied by a married woman in the household, each one knotted tighter than the last. Her lips were painted with vermilion powder, even as her mouth trembled. Her wrists were bound with red wool. No words were exchanged. Every motion was symbolic. Every detail part of an old, unwritten process designed to correct the mind through the body. At dusk, she was brought not to the altar, but to the room of silence, a chamber below the family villa, where only women entered. No records of this space exist in Roman law, yet hundreds of such rooms have been found beneath aristocratic homes. Low ceilings, no windows, a single cot. And in Aelia's case, an iron bowl of coals meant to burn incense. Though the smoke stung her lungs and made her gag, there was no guard, only shame. Only the weight of generations pressing her to fold. Every hour she spent in that space, Rome turned a little colder toward her. Her name would no longer be mentioned during meal prayers. Her birthday would no longer be celebrated. Neighbors were told she had taken a vow of religious retreat. That was the kindness allowed to girls who broke the code in private. but within the family, her name had become a curse. Alia had not just refused marriage, she had refused her place in the lineage. And for that, her survival would now depend on how long she could hold her breath inside a system that erased women not with blades, but with ceremony. On the 6th day, the silence began to crack. Alia's sister, Drusilla, slipped into the chamber before dawn carrying a basin of fresh water and a piece of salted bread. She did not speak, but her eyes darted around the room not in fear, but in warning. She placed the bread beside Alia and whispered just once, "He has written to the Vestals." It was not a threat, it was a final option. In Rome, when a girl refused her father's command, she could be offered to the priesthood of Vesta, a life of 30 years of chastity, silence, and ritual, with exile or death awaiting any mistake. It was the only path that spared the family shame, but it was not freedom, it was disappearance. And the fact that her father had written meant he no longer saw her as his daughter, but as a risk that needed to be contained. That evening, a letter arrived from the Pontifex Maximus. The response was polite, distant, and brutal. Alia's name would not be considered. She had not been trained in piety. She had not been raised in the temple system. And worst of all, her rebellion had already been witnessed, even whispered among distant relatives. That stain made her unusable. Rome had no place for a woman who had already said no. With that refusal, every avenue closed. Her dowry had been burned, the marriage broken. The temple denied her. Now only one path remained. The next morning, Alia was brought above ground, eyes squinting in the sudden sunlight. She had not spoken in 6 days. Her body was thin, her posture still proud. She was made to kneel before the household altar, where her father stood with a scroll of parchment and a wax seal. In front of 2 witnesses, he spoke a single phrase that had not been uttered in that house for over a century. Ex filia nulla. From daughter, nothing. It was a formal declaration of symbolic death. She was no longer part of the family, no longer owed bread, water, or protection. Legally, she was a non-person and therefore vulnerable to whatever the Senate's laws allowed next. But she did not cry. She did not collapse. And in that final act of stillness, she committed one last rebellion. Rome had taken her name, her future, and her voice, but it had not yet broken her will. And for a city built on order, that was the greatest danger of all. The day after her symbolic death, Alia was taken not to a prison, but to a domus near the Esquiline Hill, a private household owned by a distant cousin of her mother, one who owed favors to the family and understood the necessity of discretion. It was not an official punishment. No edict had been issued. But it was understood by all parties that she would not leave until she became willing, quiet, or broken. The villa was spacious, but every room felt hollow. There were no personal servants assigned to her, only a matron named Sabina who brought meals and watched her with eyes dulled by years of obedience. Alia's bed was clean but hard, her clothing plain. She was told to sit quietly each morning in the triclinium while the rest of the household moved around her like she was furniture. At midday, she was required to recite a passage from the laws of the 12 tables aloud, particularly the sections on women, guardianship, and obedience. If she refused, her meals were delayed. If she made a mistake, she was told to start over. These lessons were not for education, they were reminders. Alia had not committed a crime, but she had stepped outside the shape that Roman womanhood demanded. And in a society that feared chaos more than cruelty, correction became a sacred act. On the 7th night, Sabina entered without food. Instead, she brought a vial of thick oil and a folded note from Alia's father. The oil was meant to cleanse. The note was not written in her father's hand, but it bore his seal. It contained only 3 lines. Marriage is not punishment. Submission is peace. This is your last chance. No signature, no plea. Just authority, wrapped in civility. Alia burned the note using the oil-soaked cloth. For that, she was beaten, not severely, not publicly, but enough to bruise the edges of her pride. No one called it violence. In Rome, the line between correction and cruelty was measured by silence. If she screamed, it was weakness. If she endured, it was purification. That night, as the torches outside her chamber guttered low, She traced the cracks in the ceiling with her eyes and whispered her own name, as if trying to remember what it once meant. The city outside still roared with life: bathhouses, brothels, markets, temples. But for Alia, the world had narrowed to one room, one name, and one question. How long can a woman hold on to herself when everyone else is trained to erase her? By the 10th day, Alia's body was still intact, but something inside her had begun to shift. The silence had become a weight, not the absence of noise, but the presence of something colder, a kind of engineered stillness meant to stretch the mind until it snapped. She was no longer beaten, no longer spoken to. Even Sabina, who once offered a cup of honeyed water in secret, now entered and exited without eye contact. Alia existed in the corners. When she walked the hall, footsteps paused behind doors. When she sat in the garden, faces turned away. It was not exile, it was social extinction. The villa had become a crucible, and she was the element under heat. That afternoon, a visitor arrived, a man named Lucius Silanus, the same senator her father had once promised her to. He was tall, well-fed, and draped in the burgundy stripe of the patrician class. But what struck Alia most was not his presence, it was the fact that no one had told her he was coming. He walked into the garden where she sat, unannounced, and stood above her like one might examine a piece of livestock. Then he spoke, not to greet, not to plead, but to correct. He said her behavior had embarrassed his household, that his name had been questioned in the Senate, that rumors of her refusal had caused 3 of his political allies to question his control over his own women. And then he made his offer, not forgiveness, not kindness, but absorption. He would still take her. The scandal would be cleaned, the story rewritten. No one outside Rome would ever know what she had done if she agreed to marry him now. If she wore the veil without another word. Alia looked up at him and said nothing. That silence, once a form of punishment, became something else. A blade, a refusal he could not touch. Lucius stared, lips curling in faint disgust, and left without finishing his sentence. That night, a second letter arrived from her father. This time it did not contain instructions. It contained a final decree. If she would not marry, then she would be transferred to the house of the penitent, a private estate near the coast, maintained by an elite Roman order of matrons known for their ability to reshape broken girls into obedient wives. It was not a prison. It was a place of education, reform, and silence, and if she did not change there, she would not return. Alia folded the letter slowly, pressed it to her lips, and placed it into the fire without a word. She did not know what waited at the house of the penitent, but she knew what she would take with her: her name, her silence, and the one thing they had not yet stripped from her, the knowledge that she had already survived what most women never dared resist. The journey to the house of the penitent took 2 days. Alia rode in a curtained litter, flanked by 2 armed escorts, dressed not as soldiers, but as servants of the priesthood. They did not speak to her. They never looked her in the eye. Their presence was not meant to protect, it was to contain. When the litter stopped on the 2nd evening, the air had changed. The salt of the sea clung to the wind, but the sound of the waves was muffled by high stone walls. The house was more fortress than villa, perched on a cliff overlooking the western coast. No torches lined the path. Only a single brass lantern, swaying gently in the dark, marked the entrance. Alia stepped out and was met by a woman named Guyana. She wore no jewelry, no paint, no expression. Her face was lined with years, but not softened by them. She greeted Alia with a shallow nod and turned, expecting her to follow without question. Inside, the house was silent but not empty. There were no screams, no signs of struggle, only the constant rhythm of ritual. Women moved through corridors in identical tunics, eyes down, hands folded. No one ran. No one whispered. This was not a place for punishment. It was a place for recalibration. The walls were painted with scenes from Roman mythology, but only the quiet ones. Penelope weaving, Lucretia before the blade, Vesta tending the flame. Guyana led her to a small chamber with a single bed, a low stool, and a basin. On the wall above the bed, carved into stone, were 3 words: Concordia, Obedientia, Pax, Harmony. obedience, peace. That night, Alia lay staring at those words, knowing they were not a promise, they were a condition. The days that followed blurred. She was given a schedule, bathing, kneeling, reciting passages of domestic virtue. Every error was corrected with silence. Every silence stretched into a lesson. On the fourth morning, she was brought into a round chamber called the atrium of reflection. Guyana stood at the center holding a mirror polished to gleam like water. "Speak your name," she said. Alia did. "Now speak who you were," Guyana ordered. Alia did not. The silence hung in the stone room like incense. That was her first mark. Girls who resisted earned them not on skin, but on record. 3 marks, Guyana said. "And you joined the weepers." Alia asked nothing. She nodded once. That evening, she walked the perimeter of the cliff and whispered her name again, but this time to the sea. If Rome would not let her be daughter, bride, or priestess, she would become something it feared even more, a woman who belonged to no one. By the 11th day, the house of the penitent had begun to whisper about Alia, but only when they thought she could not hear. She was not defiant in the way the others had been. She did not weep, did not scream, did not beg to be forgiven and return to her family. Instead, she moved through the rituals with the precision of a statue. Each morning, she bowed her head. Each night, she repeated the lines carved into her wall. She did everything they asked, but with a hollow stillness that unsettled even the older matrons. She was not becoming obedient, she was becoming unreadable. And in Rome, unreadable women were dangerous. On the 12th morning, she was summoned before the circle of matrons, 7 elder women who had long abandoned their family names, and now served only the sanctity of feminine order. The room was circular, the floor a cold mosaic of white marble, and each matron sat beneath a bust of a Roman goddess: Juno, Vesta, Minerva, Ceres, Venus, Diana, and Concordia. Guyana stood beside Alia but did not speak. The oldest among them, a woman called Fabia, asked a single question: "Are you prepared to resume your place in the world?" Alia looked up at the busts, then at Fabia. "What place is that?" she asked. The room fell still, not in shock but in calculation. It was not defiance, it was logic, the kind of question Rome did not enjoy being asked aloud. Fabia smiled gently, almost with pity, and said, "The one your silence has earned." That night, Alia was moved to a different wing of the house. The doors were thicker, the air colder. There were no mirrors, no windows, and no routine. This was where the weepers were kept, girls who had reached their final mark, not through violence or madness, but through resistance too quiet to extinguish. Here, the goal was not correction, it was erasure. The weepers were not tortured, they were isolated, unnamed, allowed to live in stillness until they forgot the shape of who they had been. Guyana came once, left a candle beside Alia's bed, and said, "If the flame burns through the night, you are still being watched. If it does not, you are free to decide how much of you remains." That night, Alia did not sleep. She stared at the flame, flickering and small. She did not pray. She did not weep, but just before dawn, when the candle guttered and finally died, she rose from her bed and whispered the same word she had refused to surrender from the beginning: her name, and in doing so, she did not escape Rome, but she became a woman it could no longer claim. No record survives of what Alia did in the days that followed. The house of the penitent kept no journals on the weepers, no scrolls for those who had stepped outside the categories Rome understood. But a century later, during the reign of Hadrian, builders expanding the coastal road uncovered the buried remains of a sub-chamber beneath the villa ruins. It held no bones, no chains, only carvings on the walls, not in Latin, but in a primitive form of script that some believe was Etruscan. What stood out most was a single repeated phrase, scratched again and again with the point of a hairpin: "I belong to the flame, not the veil." The matron house had long since burned, but the stone beneath endured. Historians debated the meaning. Some claimed it was a message of spiritual sacrifice. Others believed it was proof of madness. But one theory, quietly passed among female scholars in the margins of the academy, suggested something different. They believed Alia was not erased, she escaped, not through flight, but through transformation. That she survived by becoming unseeable, untouchable, unnamed in every way Rome could measure a woman, and from that shadow she passed between worlds, whispering her story to those who could still hear it. Over the years, tales began to surface across the empire. In Gaul, a nobleman's daughter who vanished before her arranged wedding left behind only a single candle and the name Alia scratched into the stone. In Britannia, a Roman villa was found abandoned, a marriage contract burned on the altar, and the same phrase written in soot on the ceiling. In the eastern provinces, priestesses who tended sacred fires spoke of a woman in white who appeared during rites of passage, never speaking, never aging, but always watching the girls who hesitated before the vow. Whether these were legends, echoes, or something stranger, one truth remained. Alia's silence had outlived every law that once bound her. She had become a specter of refusal not through violence, but through endurance. Rome remembered its conquerors, its senators, its gods, but in the cracks between those names, there were women like Alia daughters who disappeared rather than bend, brides who vanished rather than vow, ghosts who walked not with chains, but with memory. And for every girl raised to kneel in obedience, there was now a question that could not be erased. What if she does not? What if she walks? What if she watches? And what if, in the silence she leaves behind, another begins to listen? Because sometimes, the most dangerous escape is not through a door, but through forgetting how to be owned. Comment the oldest law about women in your country, and if you want more stories history tried to silence, like and subscribe to Forgotten Stories, Ancient World.